The room is quiet now. Too quiet. Only the sigh of wind slips through the cracked stone window, brushing against faded velvet drapes that haven't moved in decades. The walls smell of damp, a scent that clings to old stone, mixing with something older still, the faint, metallic ghost of candle smoke. In the center, an empty chair sits in shadow, a chair that once held the weight of a queen. Not just any queen, but the one Europe chose to forget. Her name is not on the visitor plaques, not in the gilded family trees displayed for tourists. In the official record, she is a faint smudge, a name half scraped away. Yet her presence lingers, not in portraits or monuments, but in the chill that creeps across the skin when you walk these halls alone. Centuries ago, these same corridors rang with the sound of her arrival. It was winter when she first stepped into the palace, her carriage wheels crunching over frost. The courtyard was lit with torches, their flames trembling in the night air as though nervous to welcome her. Nobles bowed, their silks whispering as they bent low. Every step she took was deliberate. The marble beneath her heels rang like a drumbeat, slow, steady, inescapable. At her throat, sapphires burned blue against the pale glow of her skin. Her eyes, deep and unyielding, surveyed the court, not with the timid curiosity of a newcomer, but with the weight of someone who understood exactly what she was walking into. She was not here to be merely a wife. She was here to reign. In those first months, she embodied a paradox. She was sovereign, yet watched, celebrated, yet contained. Every gesture she made was recorded by the court painters. Her smile at the coronation, the way her hand rested on the arm of the throne, the slight incline of her head when foreign ambassadors spoke. But what the painters could not capture was the steel behind her gaze, the quiet calculation in the way she studied every man in the room. And in that calculation, there was something dangerous. The courtiers sensed it even before they understood it. They had expected a docile ornament, a figurehead to soften the image of the crown. Instead, they found themselves bowing to a mind that worked in shadows. It did not take long for the first omissions to appear. At the annual court chronicle, a tradition in which scribes recorded the year's events in lavish detail, her speeches were summarized in a single sentence. Her proposals for trade reform, delivered in precise and compelling words, were quietly credited to her husband's wise counsel. When her name was spoken in diplomatic dispatches, it was often as an afterthought. Her Majesty was present. No more, no less. It was as if the ink itself resisted writing her into history. Yet behind closed doors, she was impossible to erase. Late at night, the palace glowed from within, a patchwork of candlelight spilling through mullioned windows. Inside her private chambers, she moved like a shadow across the tapestries. The air was thick with the scent of burning cedar and the faint sweetness of imported roses. She worked at her desk until the candles burned low, her quill scratching over parchment as the city outside slept. Sometimes, a faint echo of her footsteps would carry down the empty hallways, long after midnight. Servants whispered that she was planning something, that her mind was always several moves ahead, like a chess master arranging the board. To the people, she was the radiant figure who waved from gilded balconies, her gowns shimmering in the sunlight. Mothers lifted their children high to see her. Merchants sold miniature medallions engraved with her profile. Songs were written in her honor. But behind the spectacle, she was already learning that light was a dangerous place for a queen to stand. The same faces that smiled up at her could twist in an instant. The same hands that reached for her blessings could reach for her throat. She had seen it before in the histories of other queens. How swiftly adoration could become accusation. The danger was not in the streets. Not yet. It was in the palace itself. The council chambers were filled with older men whose power was built on decades of quiet manipulation. They were polite, too polite. Each bow was deep, each smile rehearsed. But their eyes followed her like hawks. She noticed the way conversations would halt when she entered, the way decisions were finalized without her, the way her seat at the council table seemed to inch farther from the head each month. Even in her triumphs, the shadows gathered. Years later, when her name was finally struck from the archives, the officials would claim it was due to political necessity, that she had been controversial, that history had simply moved on. But the truth was this: the erasure began here, in the first days of her reign, in the subtle removal of her words from records, in the careful cropping of her figure from paintings, in the way her victories were handed to others. It was a slow killing, not of the body, but of the legacy. She did not yet know it, but the crown she had been given was not a gift. It was a cage, and the bars were closing in. The throne room glowed like a gilded trap. Gold leaf shimmered in the candlelight, catching in every carved detail of the columns. Thick tapestries muffled the sound of footsteps, and the air was heavy with the scent of beeswax and incense. At the far end, the queen sat in her high-backed chair, perfectly still, her posture immaculate. To anyone peering in from the public gallery, she looked untouchable, a figure sculpted from grace itself. But within the silent cage of ceremony, she felt the weight of the crown press not down on her head, but inward, like an iron band tightening around her ribs. The people adored the idea of her. The court adored the control they had over that idea. And the two were not the same thing. Every public appearance was rehearsed to the breath. She was dressed like a saint in silks imported from far-off looms, draped in pearls that caught the light like frozen tears. Painters captured her as the embodiment of virtue, a living allegory for purity, motherhood, and devotion. But those same hands that painted her beauty also erased her agency. She was allowed to be a symbol, not a strategist. Her speeches were written for her, her gestures choreographed. The royal calendar dictated not only her movements, but her expressions. A smile at the christening of a noble's child, a softening of the eyes at a military review. It was a performance, and she was both star and prisoner. Behind her, in rooms the public never saw, the tone was different. When she left a chamber, conversations dropped to murmurs. Names she had trusted became acid in the mouths of courtiers. They spoke of her with suspicion, layering compliments so thinly over barbs that even servants learned to hear the mockery in their praise. Her intelligence was recast as cunning. Her independence became arrogance. Her foreign upbringing, once touted as a diplomatic bridge, was now whispered about as dangerous, proof that she might not truly be loyal to the realm. Each whisper was a thread, and together they wove a noose. In theory, she held authority equal to her husband's. In reality, every decision passed through him or his council first. If an idea succeeded, it was claimed as the king's vision. If it failed, it was blamed on her interference. She learned quickly that her signature meant nothing without approval. Petitions she endorsed for the relief of famine-stricken provinces were quietly set aside. Proposals to reform the treasury were delayed until they withered. Even the charities she supported were redirected to causes favored by the king's allies. The crown was hers to wear, but not to wield. The first true fracture came with the treaty. Months of delicate negotiations with a rival power had been conducted under her guidance. Private audiences, carefully chosen words, gifts that spoke more than threats ever could. The agreement promised peace and economic growth. It was, by all measures, her triumph. But on the day it was signed, she was not even present. The king, flanked by his ministers, accepted the accolades while her name went unspoken. The official account credited him entirely. In the portraits commissioned to commemorate the moment, her figure was absent, as if she had never been in the room at all. It was then she understood. Even her victories could be stolen before the ink dried. The court's tactics were not crude. They did not imprison her in towers or strip her of jewels. They did something more effective. They isolated her. Friends from her homeland were denied entry to the palace on the grounds of security concerns. Her letters were intercepted and lost. Even the ladies of her household were quietly replaced with women more loyal to the council than to her. When she walked through the palace gardens, she noticed the way conversations ceased as she approached. When she entered a room, chairs seemed to draw closer together, backs curving to form walls she could not breach. It was a soft siege, and it was working. Then came the scandal. An anonymous pamphlet, printed cheaply and distributed in the markets, accused her of using state funds for her personal pleasure, of purchasing jewels while the people went hungry. The accusations were false, but they struck at a truth her enemies understood well. Perception outweighed fact. The pamphlet described her in venomous detail. The gleam of her gowns, the glitter of her banquets, the supposed coldness in her eyes as she passed beggars in the street. Soon, the accusations reached the court itself. Even those who knew them to be false avoided defending her openly. To be seen on her side was to court ruin. Now the crown was no longer simply ornamental. It was a shackle. The gold circlet on her head felt heavier with each passing day, its polished edges biting into her scalp. The more she tried to step outside the boundaries they had drawn for her, the more those boundaries narrowed. She was expected to attend ceremonies but remain silent in policy. She was paraded before the people, yet barred from the councils where decisions were made. She was flattered in public, undermined in private, and slowly erased from the machinery of power. The paradox was complete. She had to protect a throne that was destroying her. One spring morning, as she rode in the royal procession through the capital, she noticed the change. There were still cheers, but they were thinner, less certain. Some in the crowd averted their eyes. Others did not bother to hide their sneers. Among the bouquets thrown at her carriage, she spotted a rotten apple, its skin puckered and dark. Her gaze swept over the crowd, and she saw pamphlets, the same ones that had defamed her, clutched in hands, folded into pockets, whispered about between strangers. It was not yet a roar of hatred, but it was a tremor. And tremors, she knew, were the first warning before the ground split apart. In the council chambers, her enemies were patient. They did not need to act quickly. They only needed to wait for the moment when public opinion shifted fully against her. Every rumor was another grain of sand slipping from beneath her feet. Every stolen triumph, every isolated day, every cold glance in the palace corridors pushed her closer to the edge. The queen understood that something was coming, something she could not yet name. And when it came, it would not just strip her of power, it would strip her from history. The stage was set, the actors in position. Soon the velvet and gold would give way to steel and shadow. The court glittered under candlelight, a constellation of jewels, silks, and powdered wigs. From the balconies above, the ballroom looked like a painting come to life, every movement choreographed, every smile rehearsed. But beneath the music, beneath the perfume and polite laughter, there was another current, cold, sharp, invisible to the untrained eye. The palace was a theater, and the performance was not for beauty's sake. It was for survival. Behind jeweled doors, noble families waged wars that left no bloodstains on the marble floors, but ruined reputations, fortunes, and lives. The queen, seated at the far end of the hall, watched it all. Not as a guest, not even as a monarch, but as a player in a game where each move could cost her everything. In the Court of Knives, gestures mattered as much as armies. A glance across the table could forge an alliance. The choice of a dance partner could ignite a feud. The queen understood that she was both queen and pawn. Every smile she offered could be read as a promise. Every absence from a dinner could be taken as an insult. The court's eyes never left her. The nobles did not fight with swords. They fought with rumors, invisible blades that cut deeper than steel. One whisper in the right ear could shatter a marriage, bankrupt an ally, or turn the king's favor against a rival. And lately, far too many whispers carried her name. The palace itself seemed to listen. Servants moved through its endless corridors like silent ghosts, carrying silver trays laden with wine, and ears tuned to every word. The maids who brushed her hair, the footmen who opened her carriage door, even the boys who tended the fires. All of them belonged to someone. She learned quickly to speak in layers, hiding her meaning behind trivial chatter. Still, the leaks were constant. Ideas she had not yet presented to the council appeared in her enemies' mouths days later, twisted into accusations against her. It was a place where privacy was a myth and trust a currency too expensive to spend. Alliances in the court shifted with the seasons. Yesterday's allies might be tomorrow's conspirators, and those she believed loyal often revealed their allegiance to another family entirely. She had once counted on the support of an influential duke, a man who had sworn to back her reforms. But at a council session, he stood, praised her vision, and then quietly amended it in a way that gutted its purpose. The room applauded, believing the compromise was her own. By the time the meeting ended, her plan was unrecognizable, its benefits flowing not to the people, but to the very noble houses she had sought to restrain. It was like trying to play chess on a board where the pieces moved themselves. Then, the famine came. It began with failed harvests in the countryside, fields where the soil cracked under the sun, barns that echoed hollow with the absence of grain. The prices of bread rose, and the markets turned tense. The queen, who had long argued for the creation of emergency grain reserves, saw her warnings ignored until it was too late. Now the people were starving, and the court needed someone to blame. Her foreign birth made her an easy target. She became the outsider, accused of hoarding supplies for her own household while the city's poor starved. It was a lie, but in the Court of Knives, truth was irrelevant. Pamphlets appeared overnight, their pages smudged with ink and fury. They depicted her as a parasite in silks, feasting while children wasted away. Some claimed she sent carts of grain to her homeland. Others insisted she had ordered granaries locked to drive up prices for her own profit. The council, eager to deflect public anger from themselves, did not refute the stories. Instead, they regretfully announced new restrictions on her household's expenditures, a move that did nothing to help the famine but gave the illusion of justice. Behind closed doors, some ministers admitted the queen's innocence, but politically, she was too useful as a scapegoat to save. One night at a grand reception, the queen stood beside her husband as a visiting ambassador offered condolences for the famine. The ambassador spoke kindly of her efforts to aid the poor. Before she could respond, the king interrupted, his voice cutting through the air. Her intentions were noble, but misdirected. We must ensure the realm's resources are handled more wisely. The silence that followed was like ice shattering. In a single sentence, he had not only undermined her, but confirmed the accusations in the eyes of the court. She smiled, the only armor she had left in that moment. But inside, she felt the chessboard tilt further against her. From then on, the whispers were no longer subtle. Conversations stopped when she approached. Courtiers who once bowed deeply now offered shallow nods. Old friends avoided her gaze. She noticed her place at banquets moving further down the table. Invitations to private gatherings became rare. Even the musicians seemed to take their cues, playing softer when she entered, as though her presence dampened the air. The Court of Knives had drawn its circle, and she was no longer inside it. It was here that the machinery of her eventual erasure began to turn in earnest. Chroniclers recorded the famine as the result of mismanagement within the queen's household. Laws she had fought to pass were now credited to others, her name struck from the margins. portraits of recent court events began to exclude her entirely, replaced by scenes that suggested the king had been alone in his duties. The slow suffocation of her legacy had begun, and she could feel it tightening. Rumors have a way of spilling beyond palace walls. By autumn, they had reached the streets in a flood. The people gathered outside the gates, their voices a low, dangerous hum. At first, it was just a few dozen, holding placards and chanting, but the numbers swelled daily until the sound was a constant presence, echoing through the palace courtyards like the roar of a distant sea. She could hear them from her chambers at night. They did not shout the king's name, they shouted hers, not in praise, but in condemnation. The court had done its work well. By the time the mob reached its full fury, the queen's downfall would seem inevitable, even justified. The palace, once her sanctuary, had become a fortress with walls that leaned inward. And outside those walls, something vast and unstoppable was gathering. It began with a single absence. One morning, the queen called for her most trusted lady-in-waiting, a woman who had been at her side since her arrival in the capital, who had once risked her life to smuggle a letter past the palace guards. But the chamber was empty, the bed neatly made, the wardrobe stripped of dresses. No farewell, no explanation. When she inquired, the steward's answer was maddeningly casual. "She has been reassigned, Your Majesty." A matter of the council's discretion. The queen knew what it meant. Reassigned was court language for removed, and it was not the last disappearance. In the weeks that followed, the threads of her support began to fray in ways that, at first, could almost be dismissed as coincidence. A letter she had sent to a foreign ally never arrived. When she asked about it, the palace courier swore he had never seen it. A friend from her homeland, one of the few who spoke her language fluently, was suddenly denied access to the palace gates. The guards, eyes downcast, told her they had orders from above. Even her most loyal servants began to keep their distance, their voices cautious, their words clipped, as though they feared being seen too close to her. The air itself seemed to thin around her. What began in whispers soon became open wounds. One by one, her allies revealed themselves to be informants. Advisors she had trusted with her private thoughts repeated her words in council, not in the way she had spoken them, but twisted, sharpened, aimed to wound her reputation. A proposal she had made in confidence was presented to the king by another advisor, altered in such a way that it now appeared self-serving, corrupt. Each betrayal was a small cut, but together they bled her influence dry. One evening, she summoned her chief advisor, a man whose loyalty she had never doubted, to discuss a famine relief strategy. He nodded gravely, agreed with her every point, and assured her that the plan would win her back the people's trust. But when the proposal reached the council chamber, it was a disaster. The measures he had urged her to approve were politically impossible, ensuring that her plan would be mocked, dismissed, and used against her. By the time she realized the trap, the damage was done. The council erupted in outrage, the king rebuked her in public, and the newspapers the next morning carried single headline: "The Queen is out of touch with her people." Soon the campaign against her moved beyond the palace walls. Pamphlets began to appear in the streets, cheaply printed, but richly cruel. They depicted her as a grotesque caricature, her face elongated into something serpentine, her hands clutching bags of gold while ragged children starved beneath her feet. In others, she was drawn in foreign dress, whispering into the ear of an enemy general, the implication clear: treason. These images burned themselves into the public mind. Few cared whether the stories were true. The pictures told their own truth, a truth designed to destroy her. The breaking point came during a public festival. As her carriage moved through the streets, the usual cheers were fractured by jeers. Rotten fruit arced through the air, striking the wheels. Someone shouted her name, not as a title, but as a curse. She saw the pamphlets again, clutched in fists, passed from hand to hand. One was thrown at her feet, the ink still wet. On it, her image leered back at her, a mockery of her own face, smeared in exaggerated greed. Her guards urged her to look away, but she kept her eyes forward. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Inside the palace, the accusations were relentless. She was blamed for every shortage, every diplomatic setback, every hint of unrest in the provinces. If a foreign dignitary arrived late, it was her fault. If a noble withdrew funding from the army, it was because she had offended him. The king's ministers began to speak of her in the past tense, as though her influence were already gone, her position already obsolete. The truth no longer mattered. Perception was everything, and perception had turned against her. Then came the most dangerous charge of all: treason. A witness, a minor courtier with debts to erase, claimed to have overheard her plotting with foreign envoys to undermine the kingdom's armies. No such meeting had taken place, but the claim was enough to ignite the council into frenzy. Her defenders were few, and even they spoke carefully, as though defending her too strongly might drag them down with her. The accusation was never proven. It didn't need to be. It had done its work. Every decision she made now seemed to tighten the snare. If she remained silent, they called her guilty. If she spoke, they accused her of defiance. If she acted, they claimed she was overreaching. If she refrained, they said she was neglecting her duties. It was a game she could no longer win because the rules changed every day and the court held the rulebook. The whispers in the palace became roars in the streets. Markets buzzed with talk of the foreign queen who cared nothing for the poor. Tavern songs mocked her voice, her manner, her supposed extravagance. Even the church pulpits began to weave her into sermons, not by name, but through parables about pride, waste, and false piety. The seeds had been planted carefully, watered with lies, and now they were blooming. She could feel the change in the air, a heaviness, a vibration, like the charged stillness before a storm. The court's daggers had done their work, and the people's anger was no longer a distant threat. It was moving closer. At first, it was nothing more than a murmur, a low vibration beneath the everyday noises of the palace, the clink of silver on porcelain, the shuffle of servants' feet, the rustle of heavy drapes in the winter wind. The queen sat at her writing desk, quill in hand, when she heard it, a distant, uneven hum, like the restless stirring of bees in a hive. She paused, listening. By the time she rose from her chair and crossed to the window, the hum had grown into something else entirely. It was voices, hundreds of them. No, thousands. The noise swelled until it pressed against the palace walls. Not a song, not a speech, but a chant. Words carried on air that smelled faintly of smoke. She could not make them out at first, but the rhythm was unmistakable. A rise and fall, a pounding insistence that drilled into the marrow. Then the words became clear. They were her name, but not as the people had once spoken it in adoration. This was her name twisted, spat, hurled like a curse. It was not a call for justice. It was a call for erasure. From the balcony of her chambers, she saw the city below the palace gates transformed. Streets overflowed with bodies. Farmers in rough wool, merchants in stained aprons, women clutching infants to their chests. In the flicker of torchlight, their faces were grim, their eyes hard. Effigies of her likeness, crudely made from straw and old gowns, swung from ropes. Flames licked at their skirts, the heat carrying the smell of burning cloth upward to her window. The rhythm she had felt beneath her feet was the pounding of boots against cobblestone, thousands moving as one, shaking the earth itself. Inside, the palace was chaos wrapped in ceremony. Ministers moved quickly, but spoke in hushed tones. as though loud voices might shatter the fragile walls, keeping the mob at bay. Some pressed her to leave at once. "We can escort you to the coast. A ship can be ready by morning." Others urged her to stay, to step out onto the balcony and address the crowd, to prove her innocence through the force of her presence. The choice they offered was no choice at all. If she fled, she would be condemned as guilty. If she stayed, she might not live to see another dawn. By midday, the first breach came. The outer gates, meant to be impenetrable, shuddered under the weight of the crowd. Guards stood their ground, shields locked, but the sheer press of bodies forced them backward inch by inch. The queen felt the tremor in the floorboards long before the sound reached her, the deep, resonant boom of wood and iron giving way. Somewhere in the palace, a servant screamed. The scream was cut short. Corridors that had once been her sanctuary now felt like tunnels in a collapsing mine. The scent of burning straw seeped through the cracks in the doors, mingling with the bitter tang of fear. Servants hurried past her without bowing. A few glanced at her with open hostility, their eyes reflecting the fury they had seen outside. The mob's voice had already reached them. It was only a matter of time before it seeped into every stone of the palace. The queen walked quickly, her skirts brushing against the marble as she moved toward the council chamber. She entered to find the council ringed around a long table, faces pale but defiant. "We can still control this," one minister insisted, though the sweat on his brow betrayed him. "The people are angry, but they can be placated." Another shook his head. "Placated? They are calling for her head." The debate spiraled. Her name was tossed between them like a live coal, too dangerous to hold, yet impossible to drop. She stood at the end of the table, watching the men who had once sworn loyalty now argue over how best to sacrifice her. Through it all, the king said nothing. He sat in his high-backed chair, hands folded, eyes fixed on the table before him. When he finally spoke, it was not to defend her, nor to condemn her. It was to ask the council what they advised. In that moment, she understood. His silence was not weakness, it was strategy. By not choosing a side, he allowed the tide to decide for him. And the tide had already turned. The chants outside grew louder, so loud now that they drowned out the council's arguments. The words were simple, brutal, and repeated until they were all that remained. "Bring her out. Bring her out. Bring her out." The rhythm of the chant matched the rhythm of her pulse. It was not anger anymore, it was hunger. Then came the message. A guard, breathless, delivered it to the council. The mob would not leave until the queen was presented to them, not to speak, not to explain, but to face them as they pronounced her fate. There was no precedent for such a demand. No law covered it. But in that moment, the law was irrelevant. The will of the crowd was the only force that mattered. The ministers debated once more, their words blurring into one another. She knew it didn't matter what they decided here. The decision had already been made in the streets below. Smoke drifted in through the cracks in the windows. Somewhere nearby, glass shattered. The chants shook the air. And in that roar, she heard not just the fury of the present, but the echo of all the steps that had led her here. The whispers, the betrayals, the lies carefully planted and nurtured until they bloomed into this moment. This was no longer a dispute of policy or politics. This was a sentence carried out not by judge or jury, but by the collective will of a kingdom that had turned on its queen. And soon, the palace doors would open. The sound came first, the groan of ancient hinges straining, the low thunder of iron locks sliding free. The palace doors, tall as the walls of a fortress and carved with the history of kings, swung open. Cold air surged inside, carrying with it the roar of the crowd. The queen stood at the threshold. Gone were the silks and jewels that had once shimmered under the coronation sun. In their place was plain wool, coarse and unyielding against her skin. Her wrists, pale and slender, now bore the cold bite of iron. This was not a procession. It was an unmaking. Her foot met the marble steps, the same steps she had ascended years before when petals had rained down and the people had cheered until their voices broke. Now those same steps felt different beneath her, not welcoming, not triumphant. They felt like a descent, each one taking her further from the world she had ruled and deeper into the one that had judged her. At the base of the stairs, the city waited. Not the city she had known, with its banners and music and sweet-scented air, but a city bristling with anger. The carriage that would take her to the prison did not arrive. That was the first humiliation. Instead, the guards ordered her to walk. A queen walking through the streets of her own capital, not in procession, but in disgrace. The same avenues that had once bloomed with garlands now bloomed with hatred. Rotten vegetables and scraps of refuse littered the cobblestones, thrown not to feed the animals, but to strike her face, her body, her dignity. She felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on her, each one stripping away another layer of what she had once been. It happened only a few steps in. A man broke from the crowd, his face red with fury. He spat, the warm fleck landing just above her cheek. The crowd roared with approval, as though the act had struck some invisible blow against her throne. The guards moved to push him back, but the damage was done. She did not wipe it away. She let it cling there, a silent defiance, though her heart burned. In that moment, she understood. This was no longer about her policies, her decisions, her so-called crimes. This was about erasure through spectacle. The walk became a gauntlet. Women cursed her in shrill voices, invoking the names of their hungry children. Men hurled stones, not large enough to kill, but large enough to bruise. Young boys ran alongside, chanting her name twisted into rhymes of mockery. Once, an apple hit her shoulder, splitting open and staining the wool with its juice. Another time, a basket of ash was thrown, the gray powder clinging to her hair like the ghost of a crown. Yet through it all, she did not bow her head. Witnesses would later recall her eyes, steady, unflinching, scanning the crowd as if memorizing every face. It was not a plea for mercy. It was not even a plea for understanding. It was something colder, sharper, a dare, a challenge to history itself to remember her as she was, not as they painted her. But the cruelty of the moment was in the irony. The more she held her head high, the more the crowd saw arrogance. The more she met their gaze, the more they believed she felt no shame. Perception was no longer in her hands. Midway through the march, she saw it. A grotesque effigy hanging from a wooden beam outside a tavern. It wore a mock crown, its head stuffed with straw, its painted face bearing her likeness distorted into a sneer. Flames licked its feet, curling upward to devour it whole. The crowd cheered as the fire reached the crown, melting it into blackened metal. The queen's pace never faltered, but inside she felt the heat, not from the flames, but from the knowledge that this was not just a symbol of her destruction. It was rehearsal. Even the guards seemed different. Once they had been her shield, moving with precision to keep her safe from danger. Now they were her wardens, ensuring she did not flee but doing little to stop the insults and projectiles that rained down. Their eyes did not meet hers. Perhaps they feared seeing themselves reflected in her fall. Perhaps they feared they might still feel loyalty. Either way, their silence was as heavy as the iron on her wrists. The road to the prison seemed endless. The buildings loomed close, their windows dark with watching faces. The smell of smoke hung in the air. From hearth fires, from torches, from the burning effigies that marked her path like mileposts toward oblivion. Every sound echoed. The clatter of her chains against her skirts, the crunch of her boots on grit, the roar of the crowd rising and falling like a tide. It was a tide that would not recede. Near the final turn, a group of children stood waiting. They could not have been more than 10 years old. In their hands were stones, smooth and round from the riverbed. They threw them, not with the rage of the adults, but with the unthinking cruelty of play. One struck her arm, another her side. The third hit just above her temple, making her vision blur for a moment. The guards laughed softly. She kept walking. At last, the great shadow of the prison loomed. A fortress of black stone, its walls damp with centuries of rain. The gates opened, and the noise of the crowd fell away, replaced by the hollow echo of her footsteps in the courtyard. The air here was colder, sharper, smelling of iron and mildew. The guards led her through a narrow archway, down a hall lit only by torches. Each step felt like the closing of a door behind her, doors that would never open again. Just before the heavy door of her cell swung shut, she turned. Through the narrow slit of the prison gate, she could still see a fragment of the street, still hear the fading roar of the mob. She realized then that in their eyes, she was no longer a queen. She was a cautionary tale, a living warning to any who might follow her path. And the cruelest truth? That was exactly how the court wanted her remembered. The marble had fallen away. Only stone remained, cold, unyielding, and absolute. Now came the silence. The door slammed shut with a sound that did not echo. It absorbed into the walls, as though the cell itself had swallowed it. For a moment, the queen stood in darkness. Not the velvet darkness of palace nights, where candlelight danced just beyond reach, but the kind that seemed to press against the skin, heavy and absolute. Then a thin line of light appeared, a slit from a window high above her head. Too small for a view, too narrow to tell the hour. It was enough to remind her that somewhere beyond these walls, the sky still existed, though it was no longer hers to see. The cell was little more than a stone box. The walls were slick with damp, beads of water catching the faint light before rolling down in cold trails. The floor was uneven, each step landing on a different plane of roughness. In one corner sat a wooden cot, its straw mattress flattened and sour with years of use. The smell of mildew clung to it. In another corner, a rusted bucket served as her only privacy. There were no mirrors, no tapestries, no marks of self, only the slow, deliberate stripping away of identity. Her first day in the cell, or what she guessed was her first, ended with a scrape at the door. A wooden bowl pushed through a small hatch near the floor. Inside, a thin stew floated with grayed vegetables and the occasional shred of meat. No voice accompanied it, no acknowledgement of her presence. She crouched, lifted it in her hands, and for a moment, stared at her reflection in the broth's oily surface. Even here, she kept her back straight as she ate, refusing to hunch like an animal. But she could not shake the thought. This was how the days would mark themselves now. Not by sunrises, not by court schedules, but by the scrape of a bowl against stone. Silence became her constant companion. It was not the peaceful silence of a library or chapel, but a hollow, airless kind. The kind that swallowed your own breathing and made your heartbeat sound too loud. When sound did come, it was sharp and cruel. The sudden bark of guards' laughter echoing down the corridor, the clatter of keys, the muffled sobs of someone in another cell, the distant scream that cut off too soon. In the stillness between those noises, her thoughts grew louder. She began to write. On scraps of parchment the guards grudgingly provided, she penned letters to her husband, to her family abroad, to ministers who had once pledged their loyalty. She wrote of her innocence, of the trials that she knew were being staged against her. She begged for truth, if not for her own sake, then for the sake of the realm. But the replies never came. Weeks later, she learned from a sympathetic guard, one who dared not speak to her except in whispers, that her letters had never left the prison. They had been confiscated, locked away in some archive of unspoken words. Her voice had been buried before her body could be. Beyond the stone walls, a different theater unfolded. The trial had begun without her. Witnesses were summoned and rewarded for their testimony. Documents were forged, dates altered. The charges against her grew by the day: mismanagement, treason, conspiracy with foreign powers. Evidence was presented without her presence. Decisions were made before she could hear the accusations, let alone defend herself. In the city, the story was already written. The queen was guilty. The proceedings were merely the ritual to sanctify it. Without the trappings of royalty, she was forced to confront a truth she had long avoided. Her identity had been built not only on her actions, but on the symbols that surrounded her: the crown, the court, the rituals. Now stripped of them, she began to wonder if the person in the cot was the same one who had once commanded armies and bent ministers to her will. Her hands, once adorned with rings, were bare and reddened from the cold. Her gowns had been replaced by coarse cloth that left her skin raw. Even her name felt distant when she thought it, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. And yet, she clung to one dangerous thing: memory. She remembered the corridors of the palace, the feel of the marble beneath her slippers, the way sunlight spilled through the stained glass windows in the great hall. She remembered the exact timbre of her husband's voice when he swore loyalty before the altar. She remembered the council chamber, the treaties she had crafted, the reforms she had fought for. These memories were not comfort. They were rebellion. In a place built to erase her, to reduce her to nothing, remembering who she had been was an act of defiance. There was a cruel paradox in her imprisonment. Outside these walls, she was painted as a scheming monster, plotting from her cell. Inside, she had less influence than the lowliest servant in the palace. The world believed she still held invisible strings, yet she could not even control when she ate or whether her letters were sent. She had been condemned for her power and then stripped of it completely. Days bled into each other, indistinguishable except for the cold that deepened in winter and the dampness that thickened with spring. She measured time by the growth of moss along one corner of the wall, by the wear of her shoes as she paced the cell in slow, measured circuits. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she thought she heard her name whispered from the corridor, not by the guards, but by the stones themselves, remembering. It was in that monotony that she began to see the deeper pattern. Her imprisonment was not simply punishment, it was transformation, not of her, but of her story. Every day she spent here, cut off from the world, allowed her enemies to rewrite her in the minds of the people. She could not speak to counter them, could not act to prove them wrong. Her absence was the canvas on which they painted their version of her life. She knew then that when the cell door finally opened, if it ever did, she would not be walking out as the woman who had entered. And perhaps that was the point. The silence had not broken her, but it had begun to reshape her in ways she could not yet see. The end came quietly. No fanfare, no trial day crowds, no slow procession to the scaffold designed to wring every last drop of spectacle from the condemned. Instead, it was a morning like any other in the prison. Gray light leaking through the slit of the cell window, the scrape of the food bowl across the floor. Only this time, the bowl never arrived. The guards came instead. Two men, faces blank, hands steady. They did not speak as they unlocked her door. They did not say why, but she understood. The absence of words told her everything. She was led down a corridor she had never seen before, the stones beneath her boots colder, smoother than those in her cell. The air smelled of iron and damp wood, the scent of the scaffold waiting beyond. There were no jeering crowds here, no public reckoning. The execution was to be private, stripped of the theater that had filled her downfall. It was swifter than rumor, as though those in power wanted her gone before her name could once again become a rallying cry. When they tied the blindfold, she felt the coarse fabric against her cheek and thought, strangely, of the silk veils she had once worn in the palace gardens. The distance between those two lives felt infinite. There were no speeches, no confessions, no last words offered. The blade fell in a single efficient arc. A sharp crack of wood, a flash of movement, and it was over. The shroud was pulled over what remained. The silence after was heavier than any roar of a crowd. It was the silence of an ending no one was meant to witness, of a life deliberately erased without the dignity of memory. But the true execution began after. Within hours, scribes in the royal archives were ordered to remove her name from official records. Not struck through. Removed entirely, leaving blank spaces where her reign should have been. Portraits were taken down from palace halls and dragged into storerooms. Some were slashed, others painted over, her face replaced with another's, or blotted into shadow. Even her personal possessions, the gifts she had received from foreign courts, the gowns she had worn to state banquets, were scattered, sold, or destroyed. Pieces of her life were disassembled like the bones of a skeleton, hidden so no one could reconstruct the whole. The churches followed. Once, her name had been spoken in litany alongside the king's, prayers offered for her health, for her soul, for the prosperity of the realm. Now it vanished from sermons as though she had never existed. Priests who had blessed her coronation quietly omitted her from the genealogy of the royal house. Her image, once worked into the stained glass of a cathedral window, was replaced with an anonymous saint. This was more than omission. It was denial, an unspoken agreement that to speak of her at all was to risk sharing her fate. In the city streets, the official version of her life was distributed in broadsheets. The Queen had been a traitor. The Queen had squandered the treasury. The Queen had endangered the kingdom with her foreign ties. The story was simple, brutal, and unchanging. It made no mention of her reforms, her diplomacy, the treaties she had forged. It reduced years of complexity into a single, cautionary tale: ambition, arrogance, and downfall. The more the story was repeated, the more it hardened into truth in the public mind. One of the final acts of erasure was the burning of her correspondence. Boxes of her letters, personal and political, were carried to the palace courtyard and set alight. The parchment curled inward, blackened, and disintegrated, taking with it not only her words, but the evidence of her perspective. Witnesses said the flames smelled faintly of beeswax and rosewater, the scent of her writing desk, of the world in which those letters had been composed. By the time the ashes cooled, her voice had been silenced in the most literal sense. And yet, memory is a stubborn thing. While the official records showed nothing, fragments of her survived in the shadows. A portrait hidden in the back room of a merchant's house, a locket engraved with her initials, passed down quietly through generations. In taverns, old men still told stories of seeing her ride through the city gates on the day of her coronation. In rural villages, women whispered about the time she had stopped her carriage to speak to a farmer's daughter, pressing a gold coin into her hand. The court could control ink and stone. They could not fully control the human tongue. The more her enemies tried to erase her, the more they gave her legend a new shape. She was no longer the queen as she had truly been, flesh and bone, complex and flawed. She became something else entirely, a ghost in Europe's story, half truth and half myth, her edges blurred by time and secrecy. For some, she was a villain to be cursed, for others, a martyr to be mourned. But in every telling, she remained present, the very thing her execution had been meant to prevent. And so she lingered, not in the grand halls of history, but in its margins, scratched into the wood of a tavern table, hidden in the folds of an old letter, murmured between lovers in the quiet of night, erased in ink, erased in stone, but not erased entirely. The year is not hers anymore. The palaces have new names on their gates, new flags fluttering above their towers. Cameras now stand where court painters once placed their easels. Crowds hold phones instead of garlands. And yet, in the long hallways lined with portraits of queens, her absence is still there, a hollow space between gilded frames. The air shifts subtly when you walk past it, as if even the walls remember the one who was meant to hang there. Her ghost lingers here, not in the rattle of chains or the whisper of silk against stone, but in the posture of the women who wear crowns now, in the way their smiles never quite reach their eyes, in the way they glance sideways as though checking the tightrope they walk for cracks. History insists it has moved forward. Monarchies have modernized, palaces have opened their gates to tourists, royal families give interviews to humanize themselves. And yet, the shape of her story has never truly changed. A woman rises, radiant, adored, untouchable. She becomes the perfect emblem, a mirror reflecting the nation's idea of itself. She is praised for her grace, her composure, her loyalty, until she isn't. The shift happens quietly at first, a rumor here, a headline there. Then suddenly, the adoration becomes suspicion. Suspicion becomes outrage. Outrage becomes condemnation. The tools have changed. Pamphlets replaced by headlines, whispers replaced by viral posts. But the pattern is the same. In her time, the blade was steel. In ours, it is reputation. Modern queens and princesses are toppled not in scaffold yards, but in the court of public opinion. The blows come not from executioners, but from cameras and keyboards. One scandal, proven or not, can unravel years of carefully curated image. One misinterpreted gesture can ignite storms of commentary. And unlike the crowd outside her palace gates, today's mob does not disperse with nightfall. It lives online, endless and tireless. It is swifter, louder, and more permanent than the square where she met her own end. Those who wear crowns now smile more than she ever did. They wave, they pose, they tell carefully crafted anecdotes on television. They give the illusion of intimacy while revealing nothing at all. It is their armor, the charm offensive that keeps them in favor with the public. But like her, they are expected to walk the tightrope between visibility and vulnerability. Show too little, and they are cold. Show too much, and they are reckless. They are praised for perfection, then punished for being human. The betrayal she endured, allies turning informants, family remaining silent, still plays out today, though in subtler ways. Modern royal scandals often begin not in tabloids, but in leaks from within the palace walls. Staff members sell their stories, advisors turn sources, private conversations find their way into public forums. The circle around the crown remains a cord of knives, only now the blades are dressed as microphones and anonymous tips. And just as in her time, the monarchy protects itself, not the woman wearing the crown. Her story is rarely taught, her name absent from most history lessons, but her shape is visible everywhere. When a princess is hounded by headlines until she retreats from public life, it is her story repeated. When a queen is blamed for decisions she did not make, it is her shadow cast forward. When a royal bride is adored at her wedding and despised by her 10th anniversary, it is her cycle lived again. She is the unnamed precedent, the warning embedded in every briefing given to a new royal. Be perfect or be forgotten. The irony is that the rule born from her downfall is also the reason she survives in whispers. Royal households may pretend she never existed, but the lesson of her life is still carved into their internal laws. Her fate has become a cautionary legend, passed privately from one generation to the next. It shapes public relations strategies, dictates the balance of appearances, and governs how a royal should handle controversy. She is absent from the portraits, and yet she is in every photograph. Absent from the speeches, and yet in every carefully chosen word. If she could walk these palaces now, she would see the same games she once played, only with brighter lights and faster moves. She would see the same smiles concealing the same calculations. She would recognize the same hunger in the crowd to raise someone high and then to tear them down. And she would know that nothing has truly changed. The palace is still a cage. The crowd is still a jury. The crown is still a trap. In private, older queens warn the younger ones. They do not use her name, perhaps out of superstition, perhaps because to name her is to invite her fate. But the warning is always the same. You serve at the mercy of love that can turn to hate overnight. When it turns, it will not be slow. Those words are her legacy, though no one admits it aloud. Her ghost does not haunt in the way of rattling chains or sudden chills. It haunts in the way history repeats itself, in the mistakes made again and again, in the rules written in the ashes of her name. The faces in the portraits change, the gowns change, the technology changes, but the story is the same. The hall is silent now. The great marble throne still stands at the far end, its arms carved with the symbols of a kingdom that outlived her. The sunlight that filters through the high windows does not fall evenly. It leaves the throne half in shadow, as though even the light hesitates to touch it. Dust hangs in the air, drifting lazily in the beams that reach the floor. The banners on the walls are faded, their colors dulled by centuries. There is no portrait of her here, no inscription bearing her name, and yet her absence is louder than any presence could be. Her reign is gone, her body is dust, but in the tapestry of European history, there is a hollow space where she should stand. It is not the gap of a forgotten figure. It is the deliberate void left by those who erased her. The kind of absence that calls attention to itself, like a missing page in a book or a stone missing from a crown. Those who destroyed her believed they were protecting the monarchy, preserving the sanctity of the crown. But in removing her, they left a scar that runs through the centuries. The scar tells a truth they never intended to reveal, that a ruler's image is as fragile as glass. It can be polished to brilliance or shattered beyond repair. The court had worked for years to craft her as the perfect queen, the embodiment of virtue, elegance, and loyalty. And when they decided she was no longer useful, they dismantled that image with equal precision. What took years to build unraveled in days. The crown she once wore now gleams on another's head, but the metal is the same, and so is the risk. We will never know all her truths. The documents that might have revealed them are ash. The portraits that might have shown her as she truly was are gone. All that remains are fragments, a name in an unaltered letter, a face in a painting that somehow escaped destruction, a mention in the diary of a foreign ambassador. These scraps are not enough to tell her story fully, and yet they are enough to keep her from disappearing entirely. In the end, it is the shadows, not the light, that keep her alive. Her story is not just a tragedy, it is a warning. Power without control is not security. It is a trap. A throne without autonomy is nothing more than a gilded seat for someone else's will. And history, cruel and impartial, will always decide who sits upon it and who is erased. Every queen who came after her has walked under that shadow, whether they knew her name or not. Some learned the lesson and survived. Others did not. Centuries later, the pattern still repeats. The tools of destruction have evolved, but the mechanics remain unchanged. Pamphlets have become headlines. Whispers have become viral outrage. Execution scaffolds have been replaced by press conferences and public abdications. But the rhythm is the same. A woman rises, adored and untouchable, until she isn't. And when she falls, the process of erasure begins. Faster now, but no less deliberate. In every royal scandal splashed across the modern world, her ghost lingers, unseen but present. Those who destroyed her believed they were safeguarding the monarchy. What they built instead was a throne of ashes, a seat that looks solid but crumbles under the weight of human frailty. Every ruler who sits upon it must feel the instability beneath them, the faint shifting of the past, reminding them how quickly the stone can turn to dust. It is not her death that gives the throne its fragility. It is the knowledge that her destruction came from within, not without. The kingdom never acknowledged its debt to her. It never admitted that her downfall was not inevitable, but engineered. It never apologized for the lies that became truth in the public mind. And yet, in the private archives of certain families, her name is still written in ink that has not faded. In the whispers of historians who dare to speak her story, she remains an unsolved question, a reminder that the truth and the record are not the same thing. In the end, her legacy is not measured in monuments or titles, but in the quiet instability she left behind. Every time a royal consort hesitates before speaking, every time a queen adjusts her public smile to hide private grief, every time a monarch's image is protected with the same ferocity that destroyed her, she is there. Her name may be gone, but the lesson of her life is carved into the foundation of the crown itself. Perhaps that is why her story endures even in fragments. Not because she was perfect, not because she was a martyr, but because she was proof that even the most powerful seat in the land can be pulled from beneath you, and that once you are gone, history will decide what remains. She is not merely a name lost to time. She is a shadow cast across centuries, a whisper that will not be silenced. Her throne was built on marble, but they left her with ashes. And the ashes remain. History remembers the victors, but it is haunted by the erased.